Okay, hey everybody. Hi, Coach JJ here. It's great to see you on this Thursday afternoon. I apologize, I'm a little later than I expected, just technical things trying to work out and see what we can do. So I just want to jump right in. And today's discussion is going to be on a research paper that just came across my news feed the other day, talking about the risk of hyperglycemic crisis in people that have diabetes. And so let me back up just a little bit. For those of you who don't know who I am, my name's Joe Collins. I go by Coach JJ. That's like what all my friends call me. And so I am a public health educator and a board certified health and wellness coach. And so my job is to present information to everybody and try to help people like navigate. Like I'm kind of like the bumpers on a bowling lane or whatever, kind of a silly analogy. But today's topic, we're going to talk about what happens when your blood sugar is like super high and your risk of having an event happen from having your blood sugar too high. And the two big things that us healthcare people have encountered is we have people that have either hyperosmotic hyperglycemic syndrome or diabetic ketoacidosis. And so we're going to look into what this research paper actually says, and I'm going to attempt to share my screen with you all so that we can walk through the whole thing together, okay? Because my job is to provide you education. My job is not here to replace instructions from your healthcare provider. My job is not to diagnose you with any condition, although I will step in and say, you better call your doctor. So I can give certain types of advice to people that I directly work with on a one-to-one basis where I'm very familiar with their background and so on. Outside of that, I can't tell you what to do specifically, except I'm always going to tell you, call your doctor. If that doctor is not helping, find another doctor or physician's assistant or nurse practitioner or dietitian, whatever credentialed people that you work with. If you bring them an issue, if you find that anything I'm telling you sounds like, that could possibly be me, you got to go talk to them and be like, well, I have reason to believe X, Y, and Z because that's, I heard this and I read these things and, shown the evidence for that. And this is what I think. And your healthcare provider has to work with you to make the decision on all of that stuff. I'm just here for educational, informational purposes only. Okay. So now that we got that out of the way, just heard my cat, I think. Let's see. Okay, let's see if it changes to where I can show you this article here. Okay, so hopefully you can see what I'm seeing right now. And so here's the article that I posted in our group earlier today. And this is, how can you determine if you are a person at risk for having a hyperglycemic crisis, which is both of those conditions that I described just a minute ago, hyperosmotic hyperglycemic syndrome, diabetic ketoacidosis. I also want to note that sometimes you can also have a situation of ketoacidosis if your blood sugar is normal. My understanding, and I would definitely appreciate any of our resident healthcare people to correct me if I'm incorrect, but your blood sugar is fine, but you're having ketoacidosis. It could be a kidney issue, it could be a liver issue, but we understand this by your symptoms and then what we find on labs. Okay, so the article that we're going to be looking into today talks about which diabetes patients, it's being weird, are at risk for having this happen. And in this study, they look at very specific things about what is it that makes you versus your neighbor next door having a risk of having this happen to you. And this is super, super, super important, because this is one of the primary reasons that people end up in the hospital. And then like having to like go on insulin when they weren't before, or like having a deterioration of other symptoms and things that they have. So let's work through this article together. So we have this study where there's over 20,000 adults with type 1 and 800,000 adults with type 2. That right there is pretty interesting. Nonetheless, the article goes on to say that they reviewed all of the factors that work into things like how much money do you make? Do you smoke? Do you have a bachelor's degree? Like where do you live? Like what kind of housing do you rent or do you own? Like they look at all of those socioeconomic, sorry. They look at all those little pieces and parts because they are definitely part of how we look at getting healthcare, how we analyze getting healthcare, and you know, what happens when we get care. So these things seem like they're unrelated, but I promise they're very important. And so they looked at these people to determine what was their risk of having to show up at the emergency room or have some kind of admission to the hospital for life-threatening diabetes complications as a result of the two things that I mentioned before, the HHS and the DKA. So they, the researchers here, in part funded by the National Institute of Diabetes and Kidney Association, in part by the Mayo Clinic, you know, so these are like valid sources that we're talking about here. And they reported results in the Journal of the American Medical Association Network Open, which is a site that those of us who are clinically inclined, like we pay attention to see, you know, what's happening. But here's the super, super important thing. If you're following along on the screen that I'm sharing here, I'm going to go ahead and highlight this. I don't know if you can see it. This right here is super important. And this right here demonstrates that if you're type 1 diabetic and you've had an incident of diabetic ketoacidosis or the hyperosmotic hyperglycemia syndrome, if you've had one of those in the past, you are 8 times more likely to have another event occur. But type 2, according to their math, your chance of having this happen is 18 times higher if you've had a previous event. And that's pretty disconcerting. It's actually really scary, and it actually runs kind of counterintuitive and countervailing to what we see when we look at the ADA website and the endocrinology college people and those, you know, they always, or I've seen up until now with this, there's always this idea, well, if it's going to happen to you if you're type 1. Apparently, according to this, type 2 is huge. like double, more than double actually, because let's see, 8 and then double that's 18, and this is, well, no, okay, so double, exactly, your risk is double. No, it's not. Damn, I'm stupid. 16 versus 9. Okay, whatever. Here's the second really important thing. A high A1C is the next to strongest predictor of this with both sets of diabetes patients. If you got a high A1C that's above 10%, according to this research, you are 7 times more likely to end up having this kind of event. So in addition to that, let's see, they also talk about, and this is something that's very important, they talk about severe hypoglycemia. So that's when your blood sugar constantly tries to drop down before normal limits or below normal limits. So if you have an and they classify it as severe hypoglycemic episode. So like if your blood sugar is getting into like the 50s, 40s, something like that, that would be considered pretty severe. And so you then have double the risk of having a high blood sugar crisis if you're type 1, but more than 4 times the risk of having a high blood sugar risk event if you're type 2 diabetic. Some other things they found, according to this, is that if you have neuropathy and you're type 1, you have just over 1.5 chance more likely of developing this hyperglycemic crisis. And it's about 1.25 the risk for type 2 kidney issues. Relatively the same. You can see that right here. Pretty much the same if you have kidney issues. And then if you struggle with depression, you have this risk. It seems to be higher, the depression thing, for type 1 diabetics. Nonetheless, the IRR, that's essentially like a relative risk ratio. So, you know, they establish a baseline of, you know, no symptoms or these things, and, you know, rank it accordingly. And that's how they kind of come up with these numbers. So for being type 1 or type 2, you can have any of these conditions, but if you have each of these conditions, it increases the likelihood that you could end up experiencing this situation for which you have to go seek emergency care. Let's see. They said no other comorbidities assessed significantly tied, but there were predictions there. And those predictions include the following here. If you have retinopathy, and that's, you know, diabetes related usually, but not always, but mostly diabetes related damage to your eyeballs, and you've had to see a doctor and get shots or take medicine or something like that. If you've had a stroke, if you've had a blood clot in your legs or in your lungs, if you have a heart condition like congestive heart failure, if you have dementia, if you have COPD, if you have cancer, if your liver's going to fall out, aka cirrhosis, if you have any of those things, it seems to be that though, like, having those things are indeed a predictive measure of whether or not you're more likely to have this hyperglycemic event. Interestingly enough, they also found that folks on SGLT inhibitors or who are insulin dependent saw an episode of this hyperglycemic crisis. And I have to wonder about that. The folks who are insulin dependent, I could see how having an increase in a hyperglycemic episode could be related to the fact that, maybe they forgot to take their insulin that day, or they didn't dose enough to correct for something they ate, or they have an infection going on, something like that. The really strange thing is the fact that they mentioned that SGLT2 inhibitor first before they mentioned the insulin dependence. So that kind of makes me wonder, and I'm going to have to look into that further. I don't have exact information about that now, but so they talk about then sort of these socioeconomic factors that I mentioned earlier. Number one thing they're talking about here, financial stability. But look at their measure. Like, look at this. This is kind of funny. Well, not funny, but like weird. Oh, sorry. So they actually had people in their study that make $200,000 a year, and they say had a significantly lower risk for hyperglycemic crisis than those of a low income under $40,000 a year. And as I'm looking at their statistics here, at this point, the math makes sense. I have to write it out to double check, but but here's something that just makes me just really upset. The researchers pointed out that lower income patients are likely more prone to a hyperglycemic crisis because they're more likely to practice insulin rationing and lack insurance. Duh. Of course. Because when your doctor gives you a prescription for, this new and improved insulin type product or something, you can't afford the $800 a month that it costs when you don't have insurance and your work cut you to part-time, or the insurance is rejecting your claim or whatever. And a lot of people don't know about the fact that, like, if you truly need insulin and you can get good instruction, you can get insulin super cheap at Walmart, like just regular insulin. It baffles me that, like, these people, like, just don't intuitively get this. Moving on. This study says that Black patients with diabetes are more likely to have a hyperglycemic crisis than white patients. Gee, I can't imagine why that might happen. I'm not going to go down that rabbit hole. But if you hear me, you feel me. If you feel me, you're hearing me. So I'll just leave it at that. Midlife and older patients were less likely to experience a hyperglycemic crisis compared with younger patients. Well, that makes sense too. If you're a healthcare provider that has any understanding at all about child development, adolescent development, juvenile delinquency, young adulthood, and lifespan type stuff. And that was one of my dual majors when I was in college, and I learned all about this stuff. Yeah, it makes sense that younger patients are going to experience this because there's they do a cost benefit analysis based on what's the phrase? darn it, I hate when words leave me. Delay discounting, that's the thing. So there's this idea that, well, that's something that happens to old people. It's not going to happen to me. So I can just do whatever I want and party and have a good time. It's not going to happen to me. So yeah, of course, if you apply sociology theory to this, it makes sense that, yeah, the younger ones are actually going to have more of an issue with this. And then we go further on, and they bring up a bunch of lab results. And in this, let's see, it's 20,000 adults with type 1 and almost 800,000 adults with type 2. In the type 1, average age was like 46-ish, mostly men, mostly white. And then in the type 2 diabetes group, average age is 65 and a half-ish. Just slightly more for women and more for white folks. So the conclusion of this article, and this is actually the most important part, the findings here, let me go ahead and highlight it. The findings suggest multidisciplinary interventions focusing on groups at high risk are needed to decrease the incidence and impact. And so essentially what that means is you can't rely on the insulin or the other medications that you're taking to totally like prevent that issue. You have to be looking at other stuff that's going on. What are you putting in the mouth? What's your stress level, your mindset? Are you physically active during the day? Do you have environmental things going on? Like, might you be living in a house full of mold? Might you have recently had a bacterial infection or COVID or something of that sort? You got to start thinking about how those things could also affect you and paying attention so that when you talk to your healthcare provider, you can say, hey, by the way, this and this happened. And I know that those things are important. What do you have to say about them? And then that clinician can ask more questions of you, get more information, and then make a determination of, yeah, that's definitely relevant, or maybe it might be, or no, that's not related. You got to talk to your clinicians, but most importantly, you have to start becoming extremely aware of your body. And sometimes it's uncomfortable. I've had to do it a few different times. I don't like it, but I know that it's going to help me in the end. And I promise it's going to help you too. So on that note, I'm going to hop off here. If anybody wants or needs access to the original like scientific-y research article, it's there in this article that I'm sharing, but I'm going to go ahead and post links to that. Certainly if you have any questions or concerns, you're welcome to talk to me at any time. I'm here. And that's pretty much it. So I hope you all have a fantastic day. And Coach JJ out.